welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, the longest-serving U.S. Senator in Maryland history, Paul Sarbanes, is not seeking re-election in November. Historian and commentator Allan Lichtman wants Sarbanes' job. Guess who's writing the Ehrlich administration's environmental laws? We'll visit with Baltimore Sun investigative reporter Tom Pelton. With legislators back in Annapolis, what's at stake for working families? Tom Hucker of Progressive Maryland says quite a lot. Also, spoken word meister Chris Chandler and street musician David Roe remember New Orleans' 9th Ward.
The desperate things when made more desperate, and you, New Orleans, have been made the lowest of the low. But it is from the lowest of the low that our Savior rises.
And we've got poetry by Grace Cavalieri and Thomas Sayers Ellis on the Coffee House. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. Who will win Paul Sarbanes' seat in the U.S. Senate this November? If the Democrats hope to recapture control of the Senate, this is a must-hold for them. It's not a gimme. Early polls put Republican Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele running neck and neck against one of the two leading Democrats, former Congressman and NAACP President Kweisi Mfume. Steele trails the other leading Democrat, Congressman Ben Cardin, by a good margin. There are also some long shots in both parties who hope to replace Sarbanes. Among them is American University History of Politics Allan Lichtman. Lichtman is a graduate of Brandeis University and earned his Ph.D. from Harvard. He was a consultant to CBS News during the impeachment of President Cohen and served as a consultant to Vice President Al Gore, too. Allan Lichtman served as an expert witness in numerous voting rights and redistricting cases. He's the author of 6 books and is a politics columnist for the Montgomery Gazette. Welcome, Allan, to the Coffee House.
Thank you so much.
You want to replace Paul Sarbanes in the U.S. Senate.
I do.
Grade Paul Sarbanes as a U.S. Senator over the course of his career on a scale of 1 to 10.
Probably you'd give him not a 10 and not towards the bottom, perhaps an 8 and something more at the end of his career when he ended in a blaze of glory with Sarbanes-Oxley. Heightened up regulation on the corporations, and he will be very well remembered historically for that.
Indeed. What will he be remembered negatively for, in your mind? What is it about Paul Sarbanes that you think you as a candidate, you as a U.S. Senator, what would you want to be remembered for in contrast to Paul Sarbanes?
Well, I'm not running against Paul Sarbanes, of course.
Yeah.
Paul Sarbanes was a brilliant inside operator. That's not the kind of senator I would be. You know, I grew up, Mark, inspired by the civil rights leaders of the 1960s, and they said the cause is too great, the times are too urgent for politics as usual, for even family as usual. I believe that's true today. I'm worried about our basic liberties and freedoms as Americans. I'm worried about the future of our planet. I've got a 13-year-old. Is he going to grow up to a survivable planet? So I believe we need someone going to bring fundamental change to Washington.
Let's talk about change in foreign policy, beginning with Iraq. There now is a movement among Democrats on the Hill to set a date for withdrawal of American troops. Would you do that?
I believe I was the first major party candidate for the U.S. Senate in the United States to advocate a specific plan for withdrawing from Iraq with actual timetables and dates, getting us out by the end of next year. That was several months ago when I made my announcement. Look, Mark, the truth is, if you want to create stability in a country, that chance only comes when the occupation ends. We've seen that in places like Ireland and Algeria and Israel. You cannot create that at the point of a minute. Time will come. They've had their constitution, they've had their elections for the Iraqis to take charge of their own destiny. The Bush administration isn't going to get us there.
You are the author of The Key to the White House, most famously. which sets out a series of criteria that if you achieve a certain number of these, it's likely that your candidate, your party, is going to win the White House in the next election. What are the keys for the Democrats to win the U.S. Senate from Maryland in 2006?
The keys are very simple. You have to think creatively and act. You cannot waffle and wobble. You cannot compromise your basic principles. And that's why I'm running. I watch carefully the so-called front runners in this election. And I don't think either one of them is capable of doing what you need to do to hold this seat, and that wrap the Bush administration around Michael Steele. You can't run away from the president of your own party. It's one of the things I've written in my book, and you certainly can't run away from the president of your own party when you're stuffing in your pockets hundreds of thousands of dollars that George Bush and Karl Rove raised for you. And I believe I have a fundamentally important theme in my campaign. There is too much government intruding in our private lives and too little government meeting our needs. There has been a revolution, Mark, in Washington, a conservative revolution. George Bush and his allies in the Congress have built the biggest, most intrusive, and least responsive government in the history of the United States. And you first got to recognize that to bring about constructive change. Too much government intruding in our private lives. We should not have government crashing into our families, as in the Schiavo case, and dictating our intimate personal decisions.
This would be Terry Schiavo. Explain.
The Terry Schiavo case, the case of the severely brain damaged woman, when the Bush administration and their allies in Congress sought to overturn the decisions of many years of state courts, the decision of the husband, and dictate what should be done in this very sad and tragic case.
This is an opportunity for a segue to a different issue that you've been very involved in, because this was an issue that was a very hot button issue for Tom DeLay. You've also taken on Tom DeLay in voting rights redistricting issues regarding Texas. Explain that.
Absolutely. I was the expert witness for congressional Democrats against the Tom DeLay districting plan for the state of Texas. This plan deliberately designed to shoot down 5 to 7 Democratic members of Congress. And worse yet, it did so by cynically using African American and Hispanic voters as pawns in this partisan gerrymandering scheme. What they did, Mark, was they took African Americans and Hispanic communities and shattered those communities and put these minority voters into heavily white, heavily Republican districts where they had absolutely no influence at all over the political process. And what's really positive about this now is that the Supreme Court has just taken this case. And the Supreme Court has an historic opportunity to strike a blow for political fairness and to strike a blow for minority voting rights, not just in Texas, but across the United States. And I'm very proud to have played a role in going down to Texas 6 times and testifying against Tom DeLay's egregious partisan and racial gerrymandering.
Real briefly, Supreme Court, Samuel Alito's nomination. What should happen to his nomination?
Here's the truth. When it comes to Supreme Court nominees, forget the rhetoric and look to the record. Ever since the combative Robert Bork, remember in 1987, was defeated for his nomination, Supreme Court nominees have been schooled in appearing inoffensive and temperate in confirmation hearings. So look to the record, and I think the record of Samuel Alito does not merit his consent to a Supreme Court position by the Senate of the United States. He poses a clear and present danger to the rights the women of America have fought for over the last 40 years. At best, he will chip away until it's destroyed the right to choose safe and legal abortions. At worst, he'll directly overturn Roe versus Wade. He poses a danger to protections of women in employment and in education. And at a time, Mark, when our president is claiming to be above the law and claiming untrammelled powers to violate our privacy and spy on Americans, the record of Samuel Alito indicates that he would quite likely accede to this excessive grasp of presidential powers that threatens our most basic liberties. We don't need, one more point, we don't need to sacrifice the Bill of Rights for our security.
Let's talk about the record of Michael Steele for a second. Characterize Michael Steele politically for us.
Michael Steele is the absent man. Michael Steele is the silent man. Remember that movie, Bull Durham, where the guy, like Michael Steele, goes from the minor leagues to the major leagues, and the first thing the grizzled old veteran schools him in, Kevin Costner, is your cliches. Can you say something without really saying anything? That's the Steele campaign so far. Right now, Mark, the Senate and House of the United States are making critical decisions about education, Medicaid, about aid to the poor, about balancing the budget that is going to affect the lives of the people of Maryland for decades. Michael Steele has remained silent. He is the silent man. It's like that old show, Get Smart, where they put down the cone of silence. That's what the Steele campaign so far has been all about. A non-campaign with no issue.
Then characterize for me Ben Cardin. Is he qualified to be a senator from Maryland?
Well, he's qualified, but I don't think he's the right man for the job in these urgent times. You send Ben Cardin to the Senate, it'd be like throwing a pebble on the pond. You'll get a little bit of a rip, and then nothing will change. He'll simply slide into the club. Moreover, the guy whose policy is to compromise with the Bush administration at the very time we need to stop what the Bush administration is doing in building new coalitions. One example, he voted for the Bush-backed version of the Patriot Act, breaking with Senator Sarbanes, Senator Mikulski, and 95% of Senate Democrats who proved that if we have a backbone as Democrats, we can defeat Bush.
You're going to be running statewide if you are the nominee of the party. You are running as a very progressive Democrat, pro-labor, pro-civil liberties, pro-civil rights, pro-women's rights, pro-environment. That sells well in Montgomery, Prince George's, Baltimore City, maybe even Howard and Charles counties. Outside of that, Maryland is a pretty red state. How do you see making an appeal elsewhere in the state?
First of all, I've been all over the state. I've been to Western Maryland, I've been to Southern Maryland, I've been to the Eastern Shore. My message resonates. Remember the first part of my message, too much government intruding in our private lives. That resonates with people who aren't traditional liberals. I've also found a lot of working class and middle class Americans really care about their education. Education is the great elevator of opportunity, and our kids are being priced out of higher education. I'd be the only, Mark, lifetime teacher in the United States Senate, the only voice for our most neglected constituency, 100 million children and young adults. So message and education resonates all over the state. Everyone in Maryland is paying outrageous prices for gasoline. They're going to be paying outrageous prices for heating their homes. They know we have to get off the fossil fuel economy. That's been another one of my critical issues.
Very quickly, say that your message is resonating, but the polls indicate that you hardly register, about 2% in November in a Baltimore Sun poll. And how do you see yourself, the kind of campaign that you're able to wage, given a lack of financial resources, given the lack of name recognition, given the lack of political office? How do you see your campaign going from where it is, which is almost nowhere, to victory?
Let me say, first of all, that poll was taken only 3 weeks after I had been a candidate. So the fact that I was registering at all isn't bad. Secondly, I am raising money. We're going to have, at the end of this report period, $320,000 in the bank, which is going to put it among the first tier of candidates in this Maryland Democratic primary. But most importantly, I am out in front of the voters. I'm not running some remote control campaign based upon big money and big endorsements. I'm going directly to the people, listening to what they have to say, and telling them what I believe.
Well, we're glad to hear it. Many thanks to Democratic Senate candidate Allan Lichtman for joining us and offering his views. Lise Van Susteren and Josh Rails, two other Democratic dark horses, candidate Kevin Zeese, were also invited onto this program, declined. We chatted with Kweisi Mfume a few months ago and expect Cardin will join us in the coffee house in the coming months. I'm Mark, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
exercises all their genders. All their stanzas look alike. All their metaphors, all their bookstores, all their plantations, all their assassinations. All their stanzas look alike. All their rejection letters, all their letters to the all their arts and letters, all their letters of recommendation. All their stanzas look alike. All their sexy coverage, all their literary journals, all their car commercials, all their bribe spike blurbs. All their stanzas look alike. All their favorite writers, all their writing programs, all their visiting writers, all their writers in residence. All their stanzas alike. All their third worlds, all their World Series, all their serial killers, all their killing fields. All their stanzas look alike. All their state grants, all their tenure tracks, all their artist colonies, all their core faculties. All their stanzas look alike. All their selected collectives, all their Oxford Nortons, all their Academy Societies, all their Oprah Vendlers. All their stanzas look alike. All their haloed Holocaust, all their core hetero couplets, all their hollow halo causes, all their tone-deaf tercets. All their stanzas look alike. All their tables of contents, all their poet laureates, all their Ku Klux classics, all the Supreme Court justices, except one exceptional one, exceptional or not, one is not enough. All their stanzas look alike. Even this, after publication, might look like. This proves my stereotypes.
Welcome to 21st Century Life at the Coffee House. It's a well-known fact that the pro-business Bush administration relies heavily on ex-executives from polluting industries to quote-unquote enforce federal pollution law. Less well known is that a similar conflict of interest governing is happening here in otherwise blue state Maryland. In late December, Baltimore Sun reporter Tom Pelton uncovered a shocking collaboration between one of the state's biggest polluters, Constellation Energy, and the Maryland Department of the Environment under Governor Robert Ehrlich. In more than 50 emails obtained through the Maryland Public Information Act, Pelton revealed how current and former Constellation lobbyists were scripting virtually every detail of the MDE's aggressive campaign to kill a bill that would have, you guessed it, cleaned up Constellation's notoriously dirty coal-fired power plants. Pelton's old-fashioned investigative journalism won high praise across the state for revealing what Maryland Senate President Mike Miller called a very troubling conflict of interest. Here today to discuss this story is Tom Pelton himself of the Baltimore Sun. Tom, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we're talking about a piece of legislation that was introduced last January in Annapolis that would have reduced by 70% or more three of the toxins that come out of these coal-fired power plants, mercury, nitrogen, and sulfur, as well as reduced by about 10% the carbon dioxide coming out of these power plants. Why did Constellation Energy, that owns 3 of these 7 power plants, fight it so furiously? Why did they try to kill the bill?
Well, they're a for-profit company that would have had to pay about $1 billion for pollution control equipment.
Now, would this bill have made these power plants that provide a lot of Maryland's electricity, would it have made them unprofitable, or would it have shut them down?
The Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which was in favor of these air pollution controls, hired an economist to study just that point. And this economist concluded that no, the power plants would not be shut down by these regulations. There would not be any blackouts. There would be, however, less profit for the company. But that's about it. What we're talking about here is a profit margin question, not shutting down power plants.
Well, let's talk about Constellation Energy's revenue generation. Now, this is a very big company, about 9,000 employees, 10 power plants, and you reported in the Baltimore Sun that their revenues tripled to about $12 billion in 2004.
That's right. Record profits for
Record
Constellation
profits.
Energy. You know,
Yeah.
and if you're talking about paying about $1 billion for pollution control equipment, they made $12.6 billion in revenues in 2004 alone. And so it's an extremely profitable company. And of course now there's discussion about it being purchased by a Florida power and light power company. Why? Because they're so profitable.
Now, despite this great profitability, they fought aggressively to kill this power plant bill that would have, for example, reduced asthma in children. There are about 700 avoidable deaths every year attributed to power plants.
17,000 asthma attacks a year in Maryland.
Right. Now, so how did Constellation, now you're reporting, you sort of dug down and revealed sort of the behind-the-scenes methods that this company uses to kill legislation that it doesn't like. Explain what you did.
Well, Constellation in general is a political heavyweight in Maryland. It gives out something like $200,000 a year in contributions to Maryland politicians each and every year. They also have lobbyists who are well connected and lobby people. They also have people connected high up in the Maryland Department of the Environment. The number 2 person at the Maryland Department of the Environment, Jonas Jacobson, is a former Constellation lobbyist. The number 3 person, Steve Pattison, is Constellation's former head of environmental programs. So that's 2 out of the top 4 people at the Maryland Department of the Environment are former Constellation people. They also have their lobbyists. The Maryland Department of the Environment's face to the legislature, their lobbyist, is a person named Victoria Shade, who used to be in charge of corporate contributions for Constellation Energy. So they have some very high-placed people at the Maryland Department of the Environment. And what they did was basically former Constellation people at the MD worked with current Constellation lobbyists to have meetings behind the scene, work on joint talking points, work on a strategy session between industry and the Maryland Department of the Environment so that the environmental voice of Maryland would be working hand in glove with industry to kill this air pollution bill.
So last year you observed that the Maryland Department of the Environment was working aggressively to kill the marquee environmental bill in Annapolis last year. So you decided to do what?
I decided to do a Freedom of Information Act request to the Maryland Department of the Environment. And I thought, this is curious, why would Maryland's environmental agency be so determined, working so hard to kill this air pollution bill? So I asked for all of the emails to and from Jonas Jacobson, the number 2 man at the Maryland Department of the Environment, the former Constellation lobbyist, about the 4 pollutants bill. I got back a stack, about 100 pages of emails to and from Jonas Jacobson about this bill. Most of it was blacked out. They blacked out huge sections of it, but what remained...
Why did they black it out?
Well, they claimed that it was internal deliberations and therefore exempt from disclosure. Now, we're appealing that, arguing that this is not an internal deliberation. This is a scheming with industry to kill a bill that the Maryland Department of the Environment didn't even write. This was written by State Delegate James Hubbard of Prince George's County and State Senator Paul Pinsky.
So it wasn't MDE's bill.
It was not MDE's bill. And yet they were working back and forth with the industry to figure out strategies for how to kill this. They were so happy when it was killed that Jonas Jacobson cheered, 4 pieces dead, ain't the beer cold? Mm-hmm. And this is the Department of the Environment saying, yay, industry won.
And so what did you find when you read these emails, even though most of it was blacked out?
Well, what we found was that Constellation basically, in addition to having all these meetings that the public did not know about between industry and the MDE, their top lobbyist on this matter wrote a draft letter to an influential state senator, Senator Thomas Middleton of Southern Maryland. Now, Senator Middleton has a power plant in his district, and after this bill got a 6-4 approval vote from the Senate committee that was considering it, it was going to move out to the full Senate. Senator Middleton said, wait a second, let's get some more information on this bill. At that moment, Constellation, their lobbyists, wrote this letter saying, Dear Senator Middleton, it is the department's view that this would be bad for Maryland, in part because it would hurt revenues for our power plants. Now, here we had a Constellation lobbyist basically writing the opinion of the Maryland Department of the Environment. It was then sent to the Maryland Department of the Environment, the emails show, where the Secretary of the Environment then basically signed off on it, word for word, the exact language that the lobbyist had written and sent it to the senator.
So the lobbyist for the power plant company that's affected by the bill wrote the letter for
Word
the
for
head
word.
of the Maryland Department of the Environment, and it went to this powerful senator as written by the lobbyist.
That's exactly
And-
correct.
and also-
right before they was killed. Right.
And the lobbyist also suggested that he apparently had Constellation letterhead, that he would print the letter for the secretary on the letterhead and put an electronic signature on it.
Yeah, the industry lobbyist was talking about in these emails, well, I could sign it myself for the Secretary of Environment with a electronic signature. I could put it on letterhead myself. And so when I asked the Secretary of Environment, Kendall Philbrick, the Maryland Secretary of Environment, I said, why would you do this? Why would you, as our environmental ombudsman, basically sign off on a letter written entirely by an industry lobbyist? Long pause. I don't know. I don't remember. Long pause. He had no answer. I'll have to get back to you later on this. When I asked the number 2 man at the MDE, who was in on these emails, well, Jonas, why did this happen? Pause. What I'd like to say is that the Ehrlich administration was opposed to this bill because we thought it would be bad for Maryland. It would cause blackouts and it would cause power plants to be shut down. When I asked the Constellation company about the genesis of this bill, at first they said, well, this bill, this letter was not written by our lobbyist. It was actually, he just reviewed it. And I said, baloney. If you look at these emails, it shows that the first text came from him. It was at this time in the morning, and then it was sent to the Secretary of the Environment. So let me get back to you on that. And he said, actually, yes, it was a collaborative drafting, is what he called it.
And a lot of collaboration went on. I mean, we all know that there's a lot of behind-the-scenes horse trading between industry and government, et cetera, on bills. But this is pretty extraordinary. Now, you've covered the environment for 2 years for the Baltimore Sun. Were you surprised by this extraordinarily cozy relationship between, the government agency that's supposed to watch out for the environment and the polluters?
Well, I kind of got a feeling that something like this was going on. It was just kind of a general sense because, those in favor of these air pollution regulations were Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the American Academy of Pediatricians, Representative Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, all of the people, looking out for public health and the environment. Those against it were the Mirant Company, Power Company, Constellation, Power Company, the Edison Electrical Institute, and the Maryland Department of the Environment. And so it struck me as odd that our environmental agency would be entirely in industry's camp, and you call them, ask for opinions on this, and also the Clean Cars Bill, which is another air pollution bill, and what they would say would be virtually the same as what industry would say. So I thought something was going on there. The emails kind of laid it out that they were, in fact, working hand in glove.
Now, tell us briefly about who staffs the Maryland Department of Environment and their background, not just Constellation officials, but Ken Philbrick, the number 1. What is his background? Is he...
He managed corporate real estate for Lockheed Martin, the arms manufacturer. So our number 1 environmental guy is a guy who basically worked for Lockheed Martin, managing office parks and such. The number 2 person, Jonas Jacobson, used to be Constellation lobbyist and also lobbied for other polluters in the state. Number 3 person at the MDE, Steve Pattison, also used to work for Constellation. Number 4 person, Stuart Wilkins, used to work for WorldCom. Historically, at the Maryland Department of the Environment, there are always a few people from industry who would be in top positions at the MDE. But the Ehrlich administration put entirely at the top 4 positions industry people running the Maryland Department of the Environment. And that's different. It used to be people, environmental regulators with decades of experience at the MDE and also the EPA, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, places like that.
Now, you also revealed that 2 of the MDE lobbyists, 2 of the Maryland Department of the Environment folks who were lobbying against this bill also own stock in Constellation. Tell us briefly about that.
That's right. Victoria Shade, who is the Maryland Department of the Environment lobbyist working with the legislature, she used to work for Constellation, and she still owns stock worth at least $50. Mitch McCalman, who is a deputy waste management administrator, who had one meeting that was apparently also on the same subject of lobbying against the 4 pollutants bill, although he later disputed that, holds at least $15,000 in Constellation stock. Now, the Maryland Ethics Commission has said, in general, often in these kind of cases, when you have someone like Victoria Shade, who has her stock in a mutual fund, that it can be okay, often, if people refrain from taking actions that would directly impact the company that they have an investment in. And the MDE says, well, this is different. This is legislation that would affect the entire industry, not just Constellation, one company.
But it doesn't look good.
Well, and more than that, Constellation owns half of the major power plants in Maryland.
Right.
So any bill that affects the entire industry, really, it's 50% Constellation.
Right. Well, it sounds like, too, in these closing seconds that we have, that you're appealing the decision of the Maryland Department of the Environment to black out a lot of these emails, and
Right.
what was left was very revealing.
Right.
So we will stay tuned and see what more comes from this. Very good investigative reporting. And by the way, I want to tell the viewers that if you want to read Tom Pelton's article, which came out on December 18th in the Baltimore Sun on this issue, you can go to www.chesapeakeclimate.org and also learn more about the Ford Pollutant Bill, which, by the way, will be introduced again
It'll be a big battle again
in
this
January.
spring. Yeah.
Well, a big thanks to Tom Pelton of the Baltimore Sun for joining me to discuss his gumshoe reporting last month, showing how even in environmentally liberal Maryland, the power and money of corporate polluters can kill legislation meant to clean our air. But with a watchful and determined media, government can be held accountable. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
Yes, I can hear the band begin when the saints go marching in. By the whiskers on my chin, New Orleans, I'll be there.
Ninth Ward, New Orleans, the river has always run through you, but never so literally. She has always been a part of you, but rarely like this. Your 19th century widow's peaks are all that peaked from a river once held at bay by the hands of man. And now 21st century widows stand on your widow's peaks, once again staring in vain for the horizon to materialize the lost. But it is from the lost that your culture has always been found. It is with you, Ninth Ward, New Orleans, where the melting pot of America melts.
What has happened down here? The winds have changed. Katrina rushed in from the Gulf and it started to rain. Blew real hard and it rained for a long, long time. 6 feet of water in the lower Nine.
Ninth Ward, New Orleans. It is from you our culture has sailed in from all directions, from wayfaring sailors seeking the roughest of trade, as well as barges filled with amber waves of grain. Here the wholesome and the whore are changed forever, wholesale.
Do another press conference until the resources are in this city, and then come down to this city and stand with us when there are military trucks and troops that we can't even count. Don't tell me 40,000 people are coming here. They're not here. It's too doggone late. Now get off your asses and let's do something, and let's fix the biggest goddamn crisis in the history of this country.
Levee busted to the left, levee busted to the right. Some people got lost in the flood, some made it out all right. Poncha trainers busted way down through to the streetcar line. 6 feet of water in that old town of mine.
New Orleans, as we watch your desperate desperados. Maybe now we know you have always been there, and that you, Ninth Ward, New Orleans, like the lands beyond your levees, have always been armed. The desperate do desperate things when made more desperate. And you, Ninth Ward, New Orleans, have been made the lowest of the low. But it is from the lowest of the low that our Savior rises, like a Savior born in the feeding trough of a jackass. You are the birthplace of the blues. And America does not understand that you cannot feel the joy of song without the blue note of pain. It is pain you have felt. And who can blame you when you never really ask, "Good morning, America, how are you?" Because I don't really recall America ever asking you.
President Bush flew over in a big jet plane. Didn't stop for a photo op or to shake a hand. The president said, "Hell, these people didn't even vote for me or my old man." Still ain't it a shame what the river done to these poor people's land. Louisiana, they're trying to wash us away. They're trying to wash us away. Louisiana.
Yes, Lake Pontchartrain, once again, you have had your evil, wicked way with the Ninth Ward.
They're trying to
In Ninth Ward, you will bear its pain for a prune's age. And a slow, painful birth will come as a distant trumpet joins your blues.
I see trees of green.
And when the world asks, what is that sound?
I see them.
A Caribbean accent will answer.
For me and you.
It's just music.
I think to myself.
It's just music. It's jazz music.
What a wonderful world.
In Ninth Ward, New Orleans, your water will break.
Yes, I do.
And a new Louis Armstrong will spring from your loins to blow his trumpet with the mouth of your river until you, Ninth Ward, New Orleans, turn the Gulf of Texaco into the Sea of Galilee, for you are alive.
One by one, things fall away, everything but the sweet earth itself. Only this year, the nest's careful brush of twigs lose a summer song. He leans his bicycle against the tree. Tuscany never changes, they say, but the mountains seem smaller each season as he goes north toward Pietrasanta. Only Carciofi remain the same, clustered to the earth. Year after year, this time, the tough fruit is left for the last of those who want it. My grandfather picks them here. Although he is not a farmer, he knows where on the stem to reach. A scholar who saw the world as a work of art. He holds them like this, carries them back to his small apartment, past the piazza, behind the university wall of Pisa. Can you see the dirt on his hands as he cups them close, their hard skins, dusty particles beneath his nails? What moved him to hunger, and when that night we can't know, but that he ate Carciofi, the diary reveals. A plant flavored with olive oil. Maybe after the lamp was lit, a tiny flask of oil was brought out. Pressings from a vat near Granoia. Adding salt from a bowl, the mineral makes a fragrance rise, enough to move him to open the small window and by luck hear a nightingale. Later he will lean over his drawings, but right now he puts the finished leaves in a bowl. This is the man who imagined the gas-driven tractor which would someday ride the fields of uneven ground. Tonight, there is only the vision of a vehicle in his head, for he feels refreshed after dining. How strange to rest, brushing his hand across the linen, smudging it without thought. He will visit the farmer again, take from his fields, but for now, the mind feasts on what the eye has seen. With ochre walls, pink terracotta roofs, factories with old doors, the ride out of town, pedaling past olive groves, apple trees, pinned against fences, pruned grapevines ready to burst, covers pulled taut over seeded ground, the sun traveling to the sea, peaceful snow on the mountains. Everywhere he lived, the land ready for a new way to harvest.
Welcome to Work Life at the Coffee House. It's become a January ritual in Annapolis ever since Bob Ehrlich was elected governor. The General Assembly convenes, and the Democratic majority immediately tries to override the Republican governor's vetoes of social and environmental legislation. 2006 looks like it will be more of the same, with Democrats hoping to reverse Ehrlich's veto of legislation requiring large employers like Walmart to pay more for employee health care, and also trying to reverse the governor's veto of a raise in the minimum wage. By the time this show is aired, some of this may already have been decided, but these and other labor issues will remain important throughout the 2006 session, in part because groups like Progressive Maryland are out there pushing hard for new labor policies. I'm very pleased that Tom Hucker, Director of Progressive Maryland, is with us to discuss workplace issues in the Maryland legislature. Tom, welcome back to the Coffee House.
Thanks, Fred. Nice to be here.
So, why should we care so much about this big box legislation that we've been hearing so much about? Seems pretty upset about it, and they're threatening to pull out of the state if it passes, so what's so good about that?
It's going to happen. They're the largest employer in the state. The bill's really about health care. There's about 7 uninsured people in Maryland, and about 20% of those are kids. Now, of course, most Marylanders believe that employers should be providing health care for their employees. The bill only affects the largest employers in Maryland, for over 10,000 employees. Walmart is the only one of those 4 companies who doesn't spend at least 8% of their payroll on health care. In fact, about 60% of their workers aren't covered by their health plan. So this bill levels the playing field and encourages businesses to take the high road and provide health care for their employees rather than forcing those costs of the uninsured workers off onto the taxpayers.
But if you put pressure on the large employers, how is that really going to affect health care coverage in this state? Well,
you have to begin somewhere. It's not a bill that is going to take care of all the uninsured workers in Maryland, but it makes sense to start with the largest employers and makes sense to start with the greatest concentrations of wealth that are the greatest cause of the problem. Most people in Maryland that don't have health insurance work. Unfortunately, they work for a whole array of employers who don't provide their health care. Walmart is the biggest employer in Maryland and the biggest one that doesn't, so this bill starts with them. It's not a panacea, but it's a good step in the right direction.
Okay, the other big issue that we've heard so much about is raising the minimum wage. Now, hardly anybody makes the minimum wage anymore, so why is this issue so important?
Well, that's easy for us to say. There's about 173,000 people who do make the minimum wage in Maryland. Many of them work 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs because you can't make ends meet on just one. Now, people don't realize, I think most people don't know, the minimum wage is stuck at $5.15 an hour. So if you work full-time at one of those jobs, you're making a whopping $10,700 a year. Nobody can feed a family in Maryland on those kind of wages. This bill, too, doesn't end poverty in Maryland, which has been 3 years in a row. But it is a step in the right direction. It means a 20% raise for almost 200,000 people in the state, and that's a very good place to start.
Well, okay, but explain this. You have a federal law which sets the minimum wage. That applies to everybody across the land. So
right.
What is Maryland getting into this for?
Well, generally the minimum wage was designed to mean that if somebody works full-time, they make enough money to feed their family. That was the original intent. Congress has lost sight of that whole principle, and they haven't raised the minimum wage at the federal level since 1997. So the question is, what's the Maryland General Assembly to do? I think it's perfectly appropriate for them to impose some values, some of Maryland values on the economy by saying, no, that federal minimum wage isn't good enough. We're going to have a higher one in Maryland, and there's 17 states and the District of Columbia that have done that already.
So there's 17 other states that
That's
have
right.
minimum wages that are higher.
That's right.
Than the federal minimum wage.
Some quite a bit higher than Maryland, and a number that just went up January 1st of '06.
And what is Maryland minimum wage now?
It's
so
set
it's
at
the
the federal
same as
level.
the federal.
And that's another reason I think this is important, is this is the first time that the Maryland General Assembly has broken with Congress. And given the politics of Congress right now, I don't foresee them raising the federal minimum wage for many years to come. I think this is hopefully the first time of several that the Maryland General Assembly should step in and raise the minimum wage. The fact is the minimum wage would be over $9 an hour now if it had been indexed to the federal inflation rate back in the 1970s. But because it loses ground to inflation every year, you can still work 40, 50, 60 hours a week on a minimum wage job and make less and less in your paycheck.
Well, tell us about Progressive Maryland. What is Progressive Maryland? How does Progressive Maryland relate to these issues and get involved?
Well, we're about a 4-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan group. We're a statewide grassroots group, I think the largest grassroots group now in Maryland. And we have about 25,000 individual members that we sign up door to door all over the state because they agree with the issues that we're working on, and about 50 organizations. They're churches, they're unions, they're community groups, they're civil rights and women's groups that agree with our agenda, so many of them pay some dues, sit on our board, and pick the issues that we work on. We work with our affiliates to build the bridges between those organizations, and we work with our individual members and the affiliates to form an agenda that we can, hopefully pass through Annapolis, to make lawmakers more accountable to the public and to make the public more effective at communicating with their lawmakers about the issues that affect working families.
And you've been at this for, you say, 4 years now?
A little bit longer in Montgomery County. We started as a county group, and then we incorporated statewide in 2001.
Sounds like you've come quite a distance in a fairly short amount of time.
Well, it's a challenge. There's not a manual to doing this, really, but we've had a lot of success so far in Annapolis. The Gazette's put on the winners list the last couple of years, and each of the last couple of years, a couple of significant bills that we took the lead on have managed to pass. And
Tell us about some of those bills.
That's very hard in Annapolis. Well, we took the lead. Several years ago, we worked in a broad coalition to pass the Thornton legislation that pumps $1.3 billion of new money into our public schools and invests in a school system that had been underfunded historically. We also took the lead about 3 years ago at creating a focus on corporate tax loopholes. About 20 years ago, corporations were providing about 20% of the state budget. Now they're providing only about 6%. So more and more of the costs of providing our schools and our roads and our health care have fallen on working families and not on corporations. We closed a Delaware holding company loophole a couple years ago that now has brought in $198 million into the state and will continue to bring in about $75 million a year from now on.
Well, I know that that's an issue which is moving forward, and we see further issues relating to those great concerns in the current legislative session. Tell us some more. We talked about the minimum wage. We talked about the so-called big box bill. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other workplace issues that you anticipate will see some action in the current, the 2006 legislative session?
Well, Annapolis is always unpredictable, and it's especially unpredictable in election years. But a couple of the areas that we're looking into, and these might be bills that pass this year or bills that pass in future years, but they are symbolic of larger problems. One is we're going to be working, I think, on paid family leave. I think most people know there's a Family Medical Leave Act that passed Congress 12 years ago that provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid family leave when you have a life-changing event like a new baby or death of a spouse. The trouble is most of us can't afford to take 12 weeks of unpaid leave off of work, and we have to go back to work before that. Some states are starting to provide some income support for families so working families can take that leave with a little bit of a payment to cover their expenses, and we're looking into doing that in Maryland.
So again, there are other states that have enacted legislation like this?
There are. California has a bill like that in place. New Jersey's looking at one right now.
Mm-hmm. What about some other workplace issues or workplace-related issues that you think might see some?
Other bills, we'll have to look at the recommendations of the Equal Pay Commission that was passed by the General Assembly, vetoed by the governor, and that bill too was overridden. There's been an Equal Pay Commission looking at disparities between men and women in their pay, and have recommendations very soon. There's also, we'll be looking at a bill to create public financing of elections in Maryland. The reason that affects working people is that most of us don't have the wherewithal to write a $1,000 check to an elected official or to a candidate. Most campaigns are funded both by corporations and by very wealthy individuals, and working people are left out of the mix. 3 states have created an alternative public financing system where if you were interested in running for office, once you demonstrate some grassroots support, you can qualify for public money to run, so you can spend your time talking to voters and not just raising money at cocktail parties. In a place like Maine, where they've had that system for years now, they've passed the nation's best health care coverage and prescription drug legislation because the lawmakers are more accountable to the public now and not just to the special interests.
And again, this is an area that other states have taken action, and Maryland is now
and
also...
That's really a theme, I think. You know, I think it's very appropriate for Maryland to be taking the lead on some of these issues. You know, there's a lot of people, when you talk to people on the street, that really don't know what happens in Annapolis, and often want better results to be coming out of Annapolis. That's why, you know, we created Progressive Maryland to give people a better voice in Annapolis, a more effective voice. And most people don't have the time to be down there lobbying every day. We give them a way to, you know, make their voices heard with a few minutes a day, sending an email, making a phone call on an issue at the right time to help a bill pass.
And I mean, do you have some sense of comparison about what it's like to work in a state legislature, trying to affect legislation, trying to affect progressive legislation, workplace legislation, as compared to what it's like to try to do this on the federal level?
I think it's a lot harder on the federal level. I mean, having done both to some extent, you know, most state lawmakers have very much smaller staffs than in Congress. In Congress, you're very lucky as a lobbyist to be able to talk to the member of Congress, you know, themselves. In a state assembly like Annapolis, you can walk the halls down there any morning you want and talk to legislators, you know, face to face, and tell them what's on your mind. And in terms of where the threshold is for impacting their decisions, we have pretty small districts in Maryland. Each lawmaker represents about 100,000 people. When they get 10 phone calls or 20 phone calls, they're often rushing up to us saying, hey, what happened? Are you generating that?
Tell me, how does somebody affect this? If somebody wants to do something about these issues that you've been talking about, how would they do that?
Well, I think 3 ways.
We only have a few seconds left, so.
Sure. I think they should call or write their lawmakers. And if they want to call their lawmakers, it's 301-858. 3000 is the Capitol switchboard, or 410-841-3000, or they can go to our website, which is just progressivemaryland.org, and they can just type in their street address, and we'll queue up emails on key issues to their lawmakers that they can edit and they can send themselves. And they can also contribute to the campaign, so we have enough organizers in the field out talking to their neighbors, and they should tell their neighbors and volunteer as much as they can.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Tom Hucker. It sounds like Progressive Maryland is going to be busy during the forthcoming session of the Maryland Legislature. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been Work Life.
Thanks, Fred.